So the next figure in this movement we're going to consider is Heidegger. And he continued in sort of a similar tradition to Husserl, and he was influenced by Husserl, but he kind of went in a different way, though he did kind of continue this idea of focusing on the interaction between humans and the world. But he was interested in this idea of being, and this is where Heidegger gets very confusing and sort of difficult to understand. There's a lot of debate about what exactly he means by this, but the fundamental question that philosophers need to ask, Heidegger thought, is what is being? So what he means by being is something that's very controversial, or a lot of people don't agree on it, but basically being is something that everything in the world shares, sort of like existence, kind of. But it's not really a property or category or quality, so it's not like something like the color red or the square shape. It's importantly not being used as a noun, so that's why translators often capitalize being in their translations. Some of them don't even translate it because it's just such a term that's specific to Heidegger and the way he used it. He did this a lot with words, so Heidegger has a lot of sort of terminology that's very much his, and it makes it very difficult to read and figure out what he really means by things. So he has this idea of being when it comes to objects, but he's in the end more interested in the being of humans. And he says that we are or have Dasein, which in German means existence, or literally their being. So this kind of existence is very key to his philosophy, and it's different from the being of, say, tables. So we don't exist in the same way that objects do. We have a different relationship with the world than objects, though in some ways they're parallel to our the existence of objects in the world. But to really understand being, Heidegger thinks we need to study Dasein, which is our being, or the being of humans. And the way to do that is not to sit there and think about it, but rather to study what we do in the world, or our interactions with the world. And you can see how this is a little bit similar to Husserl. But Heidegger has a little different way of doing this. So everyday being is being in the world. So we aren't just existing, we are existing in our sort of relationship to the world. So normally we don't just sit around thinking about ourselves, right? We're normally doing things. He uses the example of a hammer. We use a hammer to drive nails into a board. Why are we doing that? To make a bookshelf. Why do we need a bookshelf? To keep our books. So we have reasons for the things we do, and we do things as part of our being. So we're not just, again, sitting around doing nothing all the time. So by studying how we use things, we can see how different things have particular kind of being. So when we use a hammer, it has readiness to hand. So this is when something is useful and we're using it, it has something he calls readiness to hand. So the hammer isn't just an inert thing that just sits there, it's a tool that we use in a particular way. And there's a particular way you're supposed to use it. It has, you could say, if you were Aristotle, perhaps that it has a function, though Heidegger doesn't talk that way. But if you try to smoke a hammer, you're doing it wrong, or you're using it wrong. So things have a sort of way they're supposed to be used. And when they are used, they have readiness to hand. It's wrong just to look at a hammer, he says, because it's not what it's for. And so when we're just looking at it, then the hammer has presence to hand, but normally things have readiness to hand. And we'll talk about that in a second. But Descartes, remember, well, we didn't talk about this too much, but Descartes, in one of the meditations, studies a ball of wax to try to understand shape and properties. And Heidegger thinks that this kind of studying things in sort of a vacuum, or just looking at them as they're sitting there, is the wrong way to think about things. You need to contemplate things in their readiness to hand, not in their presence to hand. So not in their just sort of sitting there state, but in their being used state is how you can really understand things. And so humans, Dasein, have this thing called Mitsein, which is being with others in the world, in a with world, which is Mitwelt. Again, he has all these terms. And humans are like things in that we can't be understood in isolation, but only in our relationship with the world. So just sitting around thinking about yourself is not the good way to really understand yourself for him. It's to see how we're interacting with the world. So understanding things involves understanding what their purpose is, and understanding people is to understand our relationship with the world. So, but he is interested in this, what happens when things go wrong and things no longer have readiness to hand. So, for example, if the head falls off the hammer, we recognize that it was useful and it can't be used anymore, and we start to think about its use in a way that we sort of take for granted normally. And so Heidegger calls this being just present at hand and no more of something ready at hand, which is a nice long word in German. But when this happens, he says, then we are sort of forced to think about it, the thing, or our relationship to the world in a way that normally we don't. And he calls this being confronted with this total strangeness of beings. So when stuff doesn't work is when we are sort of forced to think about this kind of thing. Not just normally when we're moving through the world we don't think about it, but when stuff goes wrong, then we start to think about what made it go wrong or what made it go right. And so like things, people are also defined by their interactions with the world. So we learn more about people by understanding the way that they interact with their environment and what their environment is than we do just about, say, looking at a picture of them or meeting them in a blank room. So Dasein is defined by concern, which he calls it, which is producing, using, or looking after something. So we're defined by what we do in the world and what we're concerned with. And what he wants for us is to become our authentic selves. So we should resist the influence of the they, which is das Mann in German, which is sort of means one in the sense of one doesn't do that, or like just sort of society, I guess, in a way, this idea that we're expected to be a certain way. He wants us to avoid that. The problem is, though, that when we look for what we are, aside from everything that's sort of thrust upon us or that we are in the world, we won't find anything. So his point is that we should find the self that's outside of the outside influences, but there is no such thing. So the ultimate nothingness is death, and Heidegger concludes that we should embrace death. But he doesn't necessarily think we should commit suicide. It's more that we should accept our mortality and our impending nothingness as part of our sort of composition, or what we are. So he thinks that we should not sort of be afraid of death or worry about it too much. So all this is just very, very quick, and people have written reams and reams about what Heidegger means by all this stuff, and it's all very strange and confusing. But it's sort of pointing toward where we're going to go with this idea of existentialism, and which is at heart the idea that we can define ourselves, and that we don't have sort of a human essence that precedes what we decide to do in the world, that our human nature, to the extent there is one, is determined by how we live our lives. And that's kind of the heart of the idea of existentialism that Heidegger and these guys are kind of leading up to.